Welcome to Drinks in the Library, the only library where drinks aren't just allowed, they are required. I'm your librarian host, Gigi Howard, and each episode I'll be interviewing a guest about a much-loved book that we will be pairing with a drink for you to enjoy along with us or consider for your next book club meetup. As always, stay curious and support your local library. Welcome back, Libration Nation. This week, we're diving into a classic piece of Southern writing with The Prince of Tides by the remarkable Pat Conroy. And my guest is also the amazing award-winning author, Laura Elliott, who I had the pleasure of interviewing while we were both attending the Virginia Library Association conference last month. Also, Laura helped us hit a home run by tying in the drink so perfectly. She owns a copy of Pat Conroy's cookbook, and she shared with me the recipe for his iced fruit tea, which was absolutely lovely and perfect. We also talked about the impact that Pat Conroy had on Laura's writing, particularly her historical fiction novel, Louisa June and the Nazis and the Waves, which is set in Tidewater, Virginia, and also won the Virginia Library Association Cardinal Cup Award. Listening to Laura talk about the historical events that framed her story while we were looking out at the water of Norfolk and realizing how close we were to where those events occurred is just something I don't think I'll ever get over. A little bit about Laura, also known as L.M. Elliott. She was an award-winning Washington-based magazine journalist, primarily covering women's issues, before becoming a New York Times best-selling author of historical and biographical fiction. Her novels explore a variety of eras: the Italian Renaissance, American Revolution, Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War, and are also written for a variety of ages. These works have won so many notable awards and have received many, many star reviews. Laura also holds a bachelor's from Wake Forest University, as well as a master's in journalism from UNC Chapel Hill. She is a lifelong Virginian and history lover. We're about to jump into the conversation, but once again, if you're enjoying Drinks in the Library, please tell someone about it. Like or review wherever you get your podcasts. All of those things help me grow, and I would just so appreciate it. All right, without further ado, let's jump into The Prince of Tides by Pat Conroy. So we're drinking Pat Conroy's fruit tea. This is from your cookbook.
Yeah, this is from the cookbook. And I think I shared with you that I had this amazing experience meeting Pat Conroy.
Yeah, what was that like?
Oh, he was so lovely. I was speaking at, the Southern Festival of the Book in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And for one of my other, my McCarthyism book. And I was so excited because I saw that he was going to be speaking. And then I saw the schedule, and he was speaking at the exact same time I was, so that I couldn't go see him. And I was devastated because I've always loved his work. It turns out that we ended up walking beside one another to go do the book signing afterward. And I was like agog because it was Pat Conroy. And he was, sadly, we've lost him now, but he was the most gracious and lovely man. We ended up, because of C&E, signing at the same table at the same time.
Oh, yeah, because your names are right next to each other.
Right, so he was right beside me. And I had a decent-sized crowd. I signed for about 20 minutes. There were about 10 miles of ladies waiting to talk to Pat Conroy. And his signing went on and on. And I watched him. He spoke. He looked up, and he addressed every single one of those people who were waiting for him for the longest time. A lot of them came with their arms full of all these different books that he had written. He asked about how they were. But here's the thing. When we were walking, I was staying actually with a college friend of mine, and she knew I loved his writing. And when I saw him in the hall, I was completely starstruck. And she said, go talk to him, go talk to him. And I was, no, he must be in a hurry. And she said, Mr. Conroy, my friend Laura is an author too. And do you know, all the way there, he shook my hand and he said, tell me about yourself. And, oh, you're a YA author. I have an idea for a story. In Great Falls, Virginia, where I happen to live, as a kid, as a teenager, we actually crossed over the falls, jumping from rock to rock. And I was like, you did what? Because that is unbelievably dangerous. He said, yeah, I don't know how to write it for teenagers. Do you think, could you give me some advice? And I said, Mr. Conroy, I don't think I have any advice to give you. But here's the final part of that story. I'm watching him he's signing the whole time. And he pulls out his wallet from his pocket and turns to my friend, whips out his MasterCard and said, will you go buy a copy of Laura's book? I'd like to have a copy.
Oh my gosh. What a gem.
He was just unbelievably kind and lovely and genuine and everything you would hope that he would be.
Yeah.
But but it's just stunning to me that he would just pull out his MasterCard, hand it to my friend who he doesn't know, and say, go buy Laura's book. I'd like to have a copy. So that's the kind of lovely, very amazingly approachable and open-hearted, but also immediately got into this kind of communion of talking about books and how to write stories and speaking in anecdotes, and just he pulled out of every single one of those people coming who waited so long. I mean, some of them were waiting for 45 minutes. He asked who they were, where they're from, what had they liked about his. But it was at least a 4 to 5 minute conversation with every single one of those people.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
So I immediately bought this.
Yeah,
afterwards.
his cookbook. Yeah, and so we're enjoying his tea, or the tea that the recipe that I made. So it's just tea, and it's fruit tea.
Yes.
So it's got pineapple, strawberries, lemon, and an orange, which I packed up this morning. We're in Norfolk right now for the Virginia Library Conference, and I think it traveled quite well.
It's lovely. I'll tell you the other funny story about recipes from his cookbook, when you said that to pick a book and something that would have paired well with some kind of drink. I immediately thought of having gone before to another podcast, which is Boozy Booksellers, with one of my favorite booksellers in Arlington. Shout out to them.
I've seen them. Is it a YouTube channel?
Yes.
Okay,
and they're amazing.
Seen them.
You all watch them. They're fabulous.
Yeah.
And that bookstore is owned by a lady who's about my age, but most of the staff are younger, a lot of them theater people. They knew my daughter. And so they're very creative and spontaneous in how they set up their book events. And they have this Boozy Booksellers, like drunk history thing. And they wanted me to come talk about Hamilton and Peggy, which actually I also have a copy of for you. And they decided to make a drinking game with all the letters of Hamilton's that I reference in the book. That's how I researched Peggy.
Oh, okay.
And I said, I've got the greatest drink for you. I have Pat Conroy's adaptation of George Washington's Punch. I didn't suggest it today because the fumes alone from that to knock you on your butt immediately. And it has so many, but I think I sent you a copy, but y'all should check out George Washington's Punch that he got from like an aunt who had gotten it handed down from some relative of George Washington, so it is authentic.
Okay.
I cut it at like a tenth of the amount that is in this book. It's meant for like a party. So I brought it with the Boozy Booksellers because we can do this drinking game of reading some of Hamilton's letters that you're supposed to take. Supposed to take a shot anytime he used 5 adjectives rather than 1, anytime he was sexist, or a lot of braggadocio, or he often had, if any of y'all think as a librarian, if you have trouble getting teenagers that get excited about reading primary documents, just take them to the website where all of Hamilton's letters are, because they're fabulous. And they're beautifully written, but very florid, and they really reflect his poetic nature, but this kind of bad boy braggadocio, and yet incredibly vulnerable. He was really young when he was when he was an aide de camp.
Yeah.
And it really comes across in these letters.
Okay.
Anyway, those poor people, I just had water. I said, if you want me to get through this, I'm not drinking this. And within taking 4 sips, they were already like stumbling a little bit and laughing and giggling.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's very potent.
Well, I'll look that up maybe for another podcast.
Yeah.
The fruit tea is great for today. As you're presenting tomorrow, and it's just going to be a busy day in general.
Yes.
So.
Yes. No, we needed tea.
Yeah, the tea and it's delicious. So it's iced tea, and I guess you could put some sweetener with it, but I think it's fine without. It's very flavorful.
Yeah, no, I love it the way you can taste the fruit in it too, which is wonderful.
I like the strawberry. I can really taste the strawberry. So, anyway, I was so excited to talk to you today about one of, I guess, Pat Conroy's most famous book, right? Prince of
I think
Tides?
so. Yes, although his Great Santini is really well known too. And that one's more autobiographical. He was a military kid, and he obviously had a pretty rough relationship with his tough love dad.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably Prince of Tides is probably the one that most people know. It's funny, I hadn't read it in so long after saying, because you asked what book was really influential at some part of your life. And I figured since you were probably talking, I noticed that somebody had mentioned The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I was going to talk about childhood books, and then I thought, because it did have some influence on me, I realized as I was writing Louisa June that there's his writing encouraged me to delve into kind of a more literary, more colloquial, and certainly a love song to the marshes and nature of Tidewater, Virginia.
Yeah.
And it's funny, having reread it, because I hadn't read it for years. I was listening to it, and I thought, goodness gracious, Mr. Conroy, there would be some things that would be edited now. Although it's really reflective of the time in a wonderful way. I've forgotten how fraught the man versus woman thing was at that time, and how very in the forefront the women's liberation movement of those libbers, were, and how there was an extremist reaction sometimes to women looking for their equality in pay. And 1973, for instance, you or I would not have been able to get a credit card if our husbands or our daddy or our little brother signed for us to have credit. And Prince of Tides reflects not armed camps, but that there was friction between women who identified themselves as libbers and men not knowing exactly how to react to it.
Yeah, so I think what you're referencing is his relationship with the psychiatrist, correct?
That too, but there are also those anecdotes and memories. It's almost like a memoir in many ways, the way he writes, and it's a beautifully paced novel. You don't get that much anymore. That really reflects his South Carolinian and Southern roots, where people talk in detailed anecdotes, please. With a little bit of wry humor, please. And so there's long scenes of descriptions, right? And there was that passage where he talked about when Tom Wingo, and his brother Luke go up to see their sister, the poet Susanna, when she's giving her first reading.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, especially with Luke, who is a Vietnam War veteran and very much kind of the hero figure, right, of the three of them, the big brother. His naturally wanting to do things that he had been raised up in the 50s and 60s to think was a polite way to respond to women.
Right.
Being flattened by some feminists for what they felt were archaic stereotypes of women.
And he was just holding the door for someone, or he called someone ma'am. And of course, I get in trouble for calling people ma'am when I'm in the North too, because apparently that's only a Southern thing.
You're from North Carolina, is that right? Where in North Carolina?
Charlotte. And I know you went to school there.
I did. I went to Wake Forest, and I went to Chapel Hill, and I was just going to tell you, so I've also let my hair, I've got COVID gray now. I let it go.
You look beautiful.
Oh, thank you. But I speak in North Carolina a lot. I go down I was just at Wake Forest and speaking and all that, and it's immediate how many yes ma'ams I get when I'm down there, which I love. And it seems to have really been accentuated with the gray hair. So no, it's good. Yeah, so it was interesting. They were, especially having just written that, where I was really deep into that time period when the novel came out. But what a beautiful study of the juxtaposition of the different movements that were going on at that time. There's so much friction now, but there was so much friction then, particularly based on gender roles and what women could come to, what they were allowed to hope for, and how they defined themselves. And the nation was really in very much a redefining.
Yeah. What is the story about? We know Tom is the protagonist.
Right.
And
it's really the story of, and I think that's why it feels so anecdotal. I mean, you really do, Tom Wingo is the narrator, even when he describes past events. And we get large amounts of backstory from everybody.
You got Dad's backstory.
Even the grandparents, right? Yeah, which is wonderful. It really does remind me of, it reminded me something that I tried to pull out in Louisa June too, but Pat Conroy definitely just does to perfection, is his recreating that sense of conversation and recounting history through anecdotes, as I said before, detailed, please, of people and family legend. And how, if you're from Charlotte, North Carolina, you'll say, my friend Betty, who was the cousin of your neighbor down the street, he went to church with your grandmother's best friend from college, and it's that wonderful kind of, who do you know and how do you know them, where did they grow up, and what did their house look like, and what was their garden like, and what did they love to eat. It's just such rich pictures of people, right?
Yeah.
So the story is that... this is going to be a great oversimplification, as you know.
Perfect.
But basically, it begins with our hero, Tom Wingo, being in an inflection point within his own life. And he gets the news from his mother that we immediately learn he has a very fraught relationship with, that his beloved twin sister, Susanna, has tried to kill herself yet again. I think it's the third attempt. And the psychiatrist who's trying to help her is hoping that a family member can come and help make sense of some of her disjointed outbursts. So he goes up to New York City. And I have to admit, I do love his talking about comparing New York and the marshes of South Carolina and how different that is. There's one juxtaposition after another, which he handles so well.
It very much reminded me, if anyone remembers the commercials from the 90s where they're having the hot sauce and they turn the bottle around and they said, New York City. Oh. You remember those commercials?
I don't know, but the thing is that there is a decade that is a total blank for me because my children were very young at that point, and I was working and I didn't watch any TV, so it probably falls right into that.
And it felt because everything they were talking about, they were like, can you believe this place? So, yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, so there's a lot of humor in those moments, as well as wonderful character reveals in how the trio of siblings react to the larger world and New York. There's so many layers to this book. One of the things I really loved, the deep-seated love and communion with nature and the tides and that pulse of nature defining human life. He really captures that sense of our being part of the world around us, especially a beautiful watery place. You know why it's called? My daddy's from this area, so it's okay for me to talk like this.
Okay.
You call it Tidewater, Virginia, because the tides come in, the tides come out. It's a very feathery landscape. There are all these, if you ever look at a map of Virginia, in this area, the tides rise and fall several times a day, 4 feet. And it's this beautiful estuary world of the Chesapeake Bay, and then up into reaching toward, you live in Richmond, right?
Yeah.
Reaching toward Richmond up the James, and all the different Chickahominy, and I can think about all the different tiny rivers that turn into huge ones as they dump out into the Chesapeake. And he really captures that sense that I think so many Americans, sadly, and those in the modern world, lose that connection with. We live in cities, we live in suburbs, we lose the connection with that kind of hum, throb of the real world. And it's very much a part of Tom Wingo and very much a part of Pat Conroy's writing, which is beautiful.
Yeah. And what would you say is like the vibe of the story?
It's tragic mostly, right? But if you boil it down to its basic essence, it's trying to find the light within the world that you can hold on to and get yourself through your demons and your past, and it's self-definition that isn't necessarily completely weighted down or outlined, detailed by your past or your families. He takes the Southern Gothic, Faulknerian, Tennessee Williams thing and puts this wonderfully 1970s, 80s spin on so much of what he writes. You're walking into what seems like a relatively simple, okay, this poor, beautiful poet has tried to kill herself again. What is the genesis of her mental health illness? That's the mystery that we're trying to unravel through the entire story. But as you know from having read it, I mean, there's just so many different layers and so many different stories that we get into, too, that are extraordinary. It's really very much an epic read.
Yeah.
And I can also tell you that because I read it when it first came out, it was one of the first, big things I read after grad school when I wasn't, reading 1,000. I was an English major, music minor, journalism minor, so I was reading all the time, right?
Yeah.
And the book was very groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but also mainly because of the way it tackled with such respect and new information mental illness. It would be hard for most people to know how backward treatment was in the 70s. They didn't even, the DSM, I think it was DSM-2 then at that time, or DSM-3, it hadn't even identified anxiety disorders at that point. And women were dubbed as being neurotic if they had anxiety. They didn't, it wasn't defined.
Yeah.
It was such a beautiful and careful, in some ways debunking the myth that is long-standing in Western literature that madness brings creativity and that they have to go hand in hand, and that's a good thing. You think about how many, they're Jane Eyre and everything, right? So he manages to walk this extraordinarily thin line of lauding Susanna's take on these horrible things that have happened in their lives, and they are indeed horrible. I'd forgotten just how horrible they were until I reread them, and it was so vividly described, which we won't give away on this, but a truly tragic and life-altering events in her life, but also with talking about how does one get out of mental illness, and there's so much damage done to everybody when someone is suffering depression. It isn't something to be mythologized, or as it was at that time.
Yeah.
And it had a really big impact on me because at that point, I was a journalist for 20 years before I first moved until I wrote my first novel, which was a spin-off from one of the articles I'd done for the Washingtonian magazine. And I wrote a lot about mental health issues. And so I was right at the beginning of my work at the magazine, and at that point, we're talking 40 years now. Okay. I was a journalist for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I've been writing novels now for 20 years.
Yeah.
When I first went to the Washingtonian, I had this marvelous editor, Jack Limpert, but I had my one little Laura Ashley suit, and it was all guys. And they were writing about politics and business, and in those days, city magazines were thick. We were all doing the Esquire thing, which doesn't really exist anymore. I was writing these long narratives that were 8,000 to 10,000 words, written in what people now call creative nonfiction. We just called it narrative journalism. But it was great training for doing novels because I was writing things in scenes. I was following people around. And nobody was writing about women's issues or mental health issues. So that was that was the hole in coverage. So that kind of became my beat. And there was something about, I can remember reading it sitting on Rehoboth Beach with friends. And it was funny because if you looked up and down the beach, so many people had The Prince of Tide. It was really the pivotal book, or the main book to be reading at that time. Like All the Light You Cannot See was a few years ago.
Yeah.
For the same kind of reasons, that epic wash of a world and then a deep dive into the psychological underpinnings of people's
Yeah.
lives. But it really corroborated my feeling that mental health needed to be talked about, because it was at that point still a taboo to talk about. People didn't understand it. As I said, they hadn't even identified anxiety disorders as being a real, mental health issue that often pairs with depression. So I started. It's not that it started me on that, but it was, yes, I am doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you how that has come back to me with Louisa June. But
That actually is where I think that talking about how Conroy's writing and the thread into your journalism experience, and then also now to Louisa June and where we are today.
I hadn't consciously been emulating his writing, but after we talked about this, I thought, I bet that had a lot of impact on me in this narrative in particular. It was during COVID that I was writing Louisa June, and I found this amazing, horrifying fact, which was in this area. In 1942, the first 6 months of 1942, 5 Nazi U-boats took down 392 of our cargo ships, averaging one a night. The Merchant Marine, who operated here largely out of Norfolk and Hampton Roads area, suffered the highest casualty rate of any service during World War II. Wow. This is such a conversation we have with that, but anyway, it was
we're right on the water.
It was right. Actually, as I was driving here, I passed the old hotel that I set the scene where they see in Virginia Beach.
The Cavalier?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
But in Virginia Beach in June of 1942, 4 ships exploded right in front of all the sunbathers. Do you know?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this hidden history, unknown history, and these unsung heroes. So my editor actually said, why don't you write something else, because we're all in COVID. And how it circles back to Pat Conroy is because it's the beginning of COVID, when we were losing so many people, it was just so like a capricious evil, right? How COVID was striking people down, and with such velocity, and without any warning, which is what was happening here. These ships, our cargo ships, were completely, they were like sitting ducks. They didn't have any kind of escort at that point. Pearl Harbor had just happened, so the German U-boats actually called it the Great American Turkey Shoot, because they could see our ships from miles away, and they would just rise up and take the ship down and go on to the next target. So that kind of parallel of the idea of sudden unexpected grief and how you deal with it, because so many of the families in Tidewater, they were the families who had the crew members, the professional sailors who were, or lifetime sailors who were on these ships. And I ended up writing about a particular submarine, the Menominee, because I found it. I did all my research. As a librarian, I will tell you, thank you.
Oh,
you all are the keepers of truth and the most wonderful, rare, and odd information that gives me, as a writer, such extraordinary, breathtaking details to then expand into stories. There is this website maintained by a librarian called uboat.net. What he had done, though, is that he very methodically wrote up the details of each of those 392 ships that were taken out, where they were hit, how they were taken down, what day it was. And if he could find the list of crew, he listed them and whether they lived or died and what their ages were and all that. Anyway, reading the crew, the Menominee, the attack on the Menominee was just a little tugboat pushing lumber and coal up by Chesapeake. This U-boat just rose up out of the water and destroyed the cargo, which was their mandate. But then they decided to go after this little tugboat, too. 18 crew members and only 2 survived. And I just thought, oh, my God, how would you handle that as a family? What kind of devastation would there be? But the detail came out that they think this kind of stunning, gut-punching fact that the Nazis probably found the Menominee because of a ship-to-shore call the captain made home, basically to say, we're okay, everything's okay, don't worry. Which told me that somebody at home was anxious, which then told me that I should include not just the grief, but also what it was like to have a parent who had low-grade anxiety and depression. How could that child, my protagonist, Louisa June, survive that?
Yeah. Sorry, I just teared up a little bit.
Yeah, no, I have to tell you, there are often times that when I read things, I had to put my head down for a minute. Yeah. And I don't want anybody to think that this is somehow autobiographical, but I will tell you that I grew up with a mother who suffered horrendously with depression in the 60s and early 70s when there wasn't any kind of medication. And like Louisa June, I grew up very watchful and like trying to assess how things, it begins with her saying, my mama has a melancholy. I can read, actually, maybe if you let me read just the opener. Yeah, but I trace this, there is a connection to Pat Conroy. I just traced it back thinking, if he can write with such searing honesty about the mental health and the traumas and how the damage, and also finding the ability to get up and out, then I can. And a librarian, part of the reason I brought you this packet here, brilliant librarian. This wasn't my idea, it was hers. She does the discussion guide, and within the discussion guide, there was also, we wanted to focus on helping kids who might be dealing with mental health issues. And here I'll pull it out for you. Okay. But there's something called this Stars in the Wave exercise, and I actually have stars for you. And she decided to do that because she knew that this is a pervasive theme of how do you cope with depression within a family. And the fact that it's little talked about, I think it's 1 in 5 children grow up with a parent who is suffering depression, and it typically takes 11 years for somebody with depression to get adequate help. And it really does affect young people's sense of security and safety and their world outlook. Or they can develop that, or they can develop a coping mechanism of Louisa June, always looking for something's nice, to tell stories, to lift people up. And I write the son that's lost, I'm not going to give away too much, who dies in the attack it's based on the Menominee. I name him Butler after William Butler Yeats. His mother's very poetic, and she's reading Yeats all the time, so he's named Butler. Okay. And he recites poetry, and he talks about when he's going out on that ship-to-shore call home, I have him talk to his mother very briefly, saying that, it's beautiful out here, Mama, don't be worrying about it, and I can see stars in the waves. And I'm going to write a poem about it. This is the last thing he says before Rachel Walker, who does my discussion guides and for many publishers as well, created this exercise for kids where they do posters of turbulent seas and dark waves, and then they take stars and write things that make them happy or lift them up, or who they turn to when they feel troubled, to put up on those turbulent waves. And they can change them. It's like a proactive identifying what helps you when you're having a bad moment. And they can change the stars with different things and there's a picture, the one that I did in there. But anyway, it was a beautiful thing that she came up with, and I'm so grateful for, because I wanted it to not only be Louisa June can show kids how to survive grief and how she gets herself through her mother's battle with depression. And I hope to give them hope as to how to get through that.
That's beautiful. I could start crying again, so.
Thank you.
But yeah, why don't you read a little bit?
Well, this is just the opening, and again, by no way in any shape or form any comparison to Pat Conroy. But I like to think that there's been a long-term influence. So this is just the prelude, the prologue from Louisa June. And it is, I don't always write in first person, but in some cases it allows me to get into a lyricism which fits for this book. Doesn't fit for my other books that are more journalistic. It fits here because you're in the marshes and you're in the tides where all these katydids and dragonflies and these beautiful sunrises and all. And it allows her to be speak very directly. So
Yeah.
my mama has a melancholy, always has, but recently it's gone from her customary pinkish gray, like a dawn mist in the marshes, still hopeful and able to clear into bright blue with the right sprinkle of sunshine, to thick storm surge purple black, like rolling waves burning. My brother Butler would tell me the best way to weather it would be to steer straight in and hold tight to the rudder. But it's hard for a being to not get lost in that swell of inky agony. Mama's been that way ever since the war arrived on our tide-watered Virginia doorstep, ever since Nazi U-boats started swarming the waters around the Chesapeake Bay. Before that, Mama used to smile pretty easy, even laugh. That's my daily goal now, to reel in a real smile from her, not just a nibble of a one, to help her find her way to shore, up out of the storm waters of her heart. But it's proven about as hard as surviving a voyage up our Atlantic coast without being hunted down by Hitler's submarines lurking in the waves. One of the best lifelines for Mama, being such a book lover and all, is a good story. But it needs to be told well, or she's disappointed, which makes things way worse. I should start with how things were before the tides of trouble rose up in our lives. That way, you, and I for that matter, can find a truer course through the waves.
Beautiful. Yeah, and it has it is reminiscent, I feel, of Prince of Tides.
Well, give me that huge compliment of that.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I did want to ask you, going back to Prince of Tides, just one last question about it is, who would you recommend this story for?
He has this stunning thing about him in his writing. And I witnessed it as he was talking to these ladies while he was writing all these books. He can be, his narratives are so engaging, and you really do feel like somebody has just sat down beside you with a cup of this beautiful tea, and is telling you this very personal story.
Yeah.
He can do that, and then all these beautiful kind of pictorial descriptions that he does. It's lush, his writing is lush. But then he can also have that really staggering, staccato, percussive, god-awful, very blunt scenes as well. And not every writer can do that. And his voices, too, are so wonderfully different and differentiated. And I'm very aware of it, too, because I was just listening to the audiobook of it, too. As soon as he begins speaking, even if they don't say, and Luke said, I know who it is because of the words that he uses for those particular characters. And he does that really beautifully. I mean, think about all those different characters in it. And he does, there would be some words that I would now say to him, ooh, you might want to pull that out. Just that specific word. But just think about the dignity. And that's something I have always tried to do as well. And part of it's because I grew up on my grandfather's dairy farm. I've known a lot of farriers. I've known a lot of farmers who would bail you out in the middle of a hurricane kind of thing. Yeah. But think about the dignity and the heroicism that he gave to average people.
I think you and I, growing up in the South, is just, you do know people, or they're not famous. They're not celebrities. Maybe they're celebrities in their little
their town.
Their town they are.
Yeah, but they like epitomize everything that's good about the human nature in terms of my neighbor's in trouble, I'm going to help them, or just having this internal moral, like family, that fierce loyalty to multi-generational family and community is really extraordinary.
Yeah.
Country philosophers too, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I know a few myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did want to give you a chance to point a spotlight on whatever you've got coming up. I know I'm looking at Truth Lies and the questions in between. That's your next big project?
That is my next big project. And I do thank you to VLA for the Cardinal Cup and Lisa Varga, who was so wonderful last year.
Yes.
And what y'all, if you don't know who she is, check out Gigi's other episode with her, because she is such a warrior for intellectual freedom.
Absolutely.
She suggested that I think about speaking again, and Truth Lies and the Questions in Between is a third docudrama, very journalistic book. Actually, all credit for the idea goes to my editor who at Algonquin, she's an agent. She's not editing anymore. She's a fabulous editor. So why don't you do something about Watergate? And I thought at first, that's a big topic. Okay. But when I kept to that theme of the three, of what are the impacts on youth and high schoolers and college-age kids on a overarching national dialogue of hate language and name-calling and otherizing of people, and banning books because they contain dangerous ideas, like they might make you question what some demagogue is telling you as being factual. So the way I managed to pull 1973 together, Watergate hearings, the ERA being undone, Roe v. Wade, and our vets coming home from Vietnam. A lot of, like with Pat Conroy's time, it's that same time frame. Connecting tissue is that truth and our willingness to listen to it, to break ranks and put country or ethics over party or tribalism, however you want to call it, was finally working in 1973 through the Watergate hearings with all the testimony that was so stunning to the American people that they started saying, wait a minute, this isn't what we want. That kind of abuse of power isn't what we want. So truth was working with that, while hyperbole and fear-mongering and disinformation and otherizing of other women was unfortunately undoing the ERA, which had been on just a beeline to being to being codified. It was a fascinating thing to do, to try to have these two very parallel, big, enormous issues, groundswell issues in our country at the same time. But that became the link. And I tell it through the eyes and experiences of an 18-year-old capital page because, thank you, history, handed me the way to do this. 1973, I think, was only the second year that they had allowed females to be pages, Capitol Hill pages.
Okay.
And pages are like runners on the House or
I had a
Senate
friend
floor.
who was one when I was growing up. Yeah,
it's wonderful. Those kids, they really do witness history. Right there. They were only there were only three to begin with. And they actually were sponsored, and in the Senate, the House didn't allow them yet. And the original three, my girls, obviously fictional, it comes a few years later, but the original three were sponsored by Republicans.
Okay.
And the first states to ratify a lot of them, the ERA, were Midwestern states.
Okay.
Not what you would expect given politics today. That was how different the 70s were. There was a lot of across the aisle work. There was a large vein of moderate thinking, both in Republicans and Democrats, so that the line blurred among the majority, frankly. So it was really fascinating, and I found some kind of amazing women to focus on as the linchpins. And the books, when I call them docudramas, is because they have these photo essays in them. Y'all are going to have to see this. And you can find a lot more. Forgive me. If you want to learn more, you can go to my website, lmelliott.com.
Perfect.
But
okay, Kent State,
the hard hat riots that were the Watergate. So each chapter opens with what happened that month. And then the chapter takes place in that 1 month. So, for instance, in January 1973, Roe v. Wade is decided. Nixon is inaugurated. Also, the youngest senator ever, Joe Biden. And speaking about the thing that we'll end with this, if you want, with Pat Conroy talking about, I was very aware of the friction between men and women at that point in terms of women trying so hard to get onto equal footing that they hadn't had and deserved and were fighting so hard for, and some men being very feminist and their thinking and supportive of it, others having absolutely no idea how to, what's my role? Going back to this connection to Pat Conroy and how in his book I was like just a little taken aback and just reminded too, I mean, he painted it beautifully of the friction between women who felt the need to be really kind of hardcore and extreme to get what they needed, which was equal pay, the ability to work even if they were married. I mean, there were so many at that point.
Yeah.
You weren't even allowed to apply for some jobs.
Yeah.
Anyway, in September of 1973, there was this, I don't know if you know about the Billie Jean King Battle of the Sexes.
I used to be a big tennis player, yeah. So
this was like the nation stopped to watch this. And it really, it just captures the entire kind of the battle of the sexes that was going on at that time.
Yeah, and she won, if anyone.
She
Spoiler
did win.
alert.
Yeah, and she won 6-4, 6-3, 6-3.
That's a clear win right there.
Yeah, and the lead up to it had been just this Bobby Riggs. Part of it he was doing tongue-in-cheek, but he was like the self-proclaimed chauvinist pig.
Yeah.
And he talked about this is going to be between the liver and the lobber, and he actually said, he's very outspoken. I want to prove that women don't belong in the same court as a man. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big lover of women in the bedroom and in the kitchen, but these days they want to be everywhere. This is Custer's last stand. The lobber versus the liver. And there are people, it was whipped up. People were taking bets on it. 90 million people watched that match on TV.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That was like most of the United States.
Yeah, no, it was. So, for instance, with this book, that is the opener of Chapter 7.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Chapter 9, because it happened in September. And so I have my girl watching it, and listening to all the back and forth among her boarding house, and anyway, and her beau. So.
Thank you for sharing. I can't wait to read it. Excellent. This has been lovely to have you with me today. And we'll have tomorrow. It's the VLA conference.
I'm so excited to be there. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to it. And thank you so much. This was absolutely. And now I have stars.
Now you have stars to say what makes you happy and what gets you through the hard times. Because y'all, this is an anxious-ridden time.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, you can take a deep breath and remember. Or a book that you love. The Brits are very good at something they call bibliotherapy. The idea that a good book where you can find answers and mirrors and windows they're the engines of empathy, right? Yeah. But they're also the engines of, oh, okay, this person survived that. Yeah. I can get through this.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. And
thank you for spending some time with me and my guest for an episode of Drinks in the Library. For more information about the show, you can find us on Instagram at Drinks in the Library, on the World Wide Web, drinksinthelibrary.com, or shoot me an email at drinkspod@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.